Okay, in our previous class, we have covered basic React components. We created a project with React, and we have seen some of the hooks. Use state, use reducer, use hook. So we have seen function-based components. If you see here, these are the function-based components. There are multiple ways to create components. Function-based components is one, and class-based. There are actually two ways to create components: function-based and class-based. So class-based is more complex, and it is useful in some kind of scenarios. And now the trend is to use the function-based views, function-based components only. Class-based components, sorry, I called it as class-based views. But actually, function-based components and class-based components are the two ways to build React components. So the trend is to use only the function-based components. So there are some scenarios where we will be using class-based components. Today we'll discuss about how class-based components can be built, and also how we can get data from a remote server, API server, and show that in the React UI. So for that, we will be using a function called fetch that we will go over in some time. So ReactJS is one tool that we used for creating this project. There are other ways to create React projects. So we will look into one more way of creating this React project with Create React app. There is a tool called Create React app. So let's use that and create a new app. Just a second. So for actually, I think APIs, we will be using one API server called newsapi.org. So this is a free API where we can fetch data from server. Basically, we can call these APIs and get this data from our React app. We'll be using this, and we will get the API key. We will sign up for this and get the API. So I'll sign up and we will get the API key. If you have signed up, you can also get the API key from here, get API key, but I'm not going to show that right now. So for this, I'm going to save my API key somewhere in my .env. I'll save it somewhere, but I'll show you later what that is, and get your own API keys. So before we can use this, we have to create a new app. So we have seen one way of creating that we as a tool, and now we will see another approach. Let's go here, and there is something called npx command. So without installing any package, without installing a package, we can use that package. So this time we are going to use Create React app as a tool. Earlier we have used Feed as the tool. This time we will be using Create React app. This is the conventional app creation tool that ReactJS suggests, and Beat is a more advanced one. That's better. So let's go over creating this. Let's create a project called My News app. So as we are going to fetch news data and show the news data, we will be using this name. So as soon as we enter, we will ask for confirmation. So it will set up everything that is required for a React project in this folder. Mine is now. It installs React, React.org, React scripts. There are different packaging mechanisms. ReactJS uses one approach and Create React app uses one approach. So React scripts is the packaging mechanism for Create React app. So how do you compile and how do you bundle these JavaScript files is what the packaging mechanism refers to. So that we will go in depth when we discuss about Webpack, how these different bundlers can be used with our tooling. So in the back old days, we didn't have this npx command. So we had to install Create React app in our machine with npm install, and then we have to use Create React app from the local installation. So now it's no longer required. We can directly fetch Create React app tool from the registry and execute directly without installing in our system. So it's set up now. If we go to use app, you can see that it ignores. So basically the node modules, it's got installed automatically. So these node modules need not be committed to the repository. So that's why we have added the React app, Create React app tool has already added this to the Git ignore. This is the standard Git ignore. And let's now go into this folder, my news app. And if we go over package.json, so there are different scripts for starting the server. So we have start. So whereas in our read package, we had read mechanism, we had different scripts. So we had dev build like this. So each packaging, each tool will have its own scripts. So when we are using Create React app as a tool for setting up React projects, we should use these scripts. Let's start the server with npm run or npm start. And it will open the server on 3000 ports. So this is the default React app that got created with our Create React app template. So I'll leave the server running. We can close this whenever we open again. It will show up again. We close this and it runs in the background. Let me leave that in the background. So next thing is to actually create the environment for fetching the data. Let's go over what it has created. We have index.js as the entry point, just like the beat. So we have a public folder where index.html is there. So in that index.html, we can see the root element, which will be replaced by this app component. So let's do one small thing. So inside the source, we have app and index.js. Index.js is the entry point, and we will move this app into something called components. All our components, let's move it into folder components. We'll create a folder called components, and let's move app.js and this this all three into components. And if you go over here, if you change the path to use components. So in our conventional JavaScript, we have to use .js extension. In React, we don't have to use .js anymore. That will be taken care of by the build tool. So here change is components. So we have moved app into components. And that's it. Yeah. Okay. Let's take a look at refresh. Logo.svg is missing. So logo.svg is actually outside of this, but we won't need it anymore. We'll be customizing the entire thing. Let's remove this and we will remove the entire thing over here. Here. I'll just put a logo here. Okay. We have the app running. So now first thing is we need news, fetching news. So we will create two components. One is for list of news elements and news items, and one is for each individual news item. News items can be fetched with these APIs, different categories, different vendors, whether you want to fetch it from TechCrunch or from BBC News, something like that. You can choose which news you want to fetch. So I will be using one of the news categories. So let's create a component called news component. That news component will be using it here in the app. Let's create a component. So this news.js, this component, usually we build it with function components. So default function news, that will be a function that returns something, some HTML. So this is the conventional way, default function based views. Now this time we are going to build this as a class based component. Let's do it with class based components. But using class based components, we have to declare a class with the name of the class news as the class, and this should extend from a component class called component. So this component comes from the React library. So basically, we need to import this component from here. So import, we will also import React, and component from React. So I'll show you what's the basic difference between these two. So the React is the default export of React library, whereas component is not a default export. Whenever we export a thing, export default app, if you see here, so we can import it like this. If we go to ReactJS, we can import it like this. The default exports can be imported without the parentheses. Even with the parentheses, it will work. Braces, even with the braces, it will work. Default imports, this can be anything, like another app. The default exports can have any meaning. We can always, this app component exposes app function as a default export, and we can use any name for that app. This app will become another app here. Whereas if I don't export this as a default export app, I cannot import, and this is complaining. Putting onto this like this, export default name, and we will just do export. So if I do export just like this, and I don't have a default export from this kind. So I cannot use directly like this. I have to use name exports. You should use like this, and you should use the same name that was defined for this company while exporting. So that's the basic difference between named imports and default exports. So if I revert back, so what we are doing here is from React object is exported by default. So we don't need to specify the braces like this. But component is a named export and it's not a default export. That's why we need named import mechanism like this. One thing we need React here, we just go back. Okay, we have defined the component here like a class component. So we have to export this component, export default news. And before we can export, so just like we had our function-based components, we have to return some HTML, right? JSX. That return has to happen in a function called render. So we have to override a function called render when we are implementing class-based views, not class-based components. We should override a function method called render, which returns the HTML that we want to send, the JSX that we want to send. Hello world. So let's use this component over here, ReactJS. We'll remove this header also. We'll use news. I have to import news from components. All CSS imports I'll import at the last, at the end. First thing we need to import news from /components, or it's within this component, so I should use /news. This one has to be renamed to news. Okay. So now let's go back. Hello world. Okay, this is the way to define a class-based component. So what about states? So in our use state and use effect, we have used in function-based views in our previous application. We have used use state and use reducer, just like this. How do we use that kind of mechanism here? So use state and use reducer, all these hooks are utility methods that will be used within function-based components. So in class-based components, we should implement these mechanisms in a different way. So for example, if I have to use a state variable in a component, class-based component, I have to override something. So there is a method called component did mount. If you go to component, you can actually refer to the documentation for all this. So in order to override states, whenever an event has to happen, whenever the component gets mounted, which means rendered, this method gets called on that component. Earlier we had to return this, and whenever by default this will render this component, and these hooks we can use effect we can use to take side effects as soon as the component loads. These are shortcuts for running these use effect callbacks on different setup scenarios. When the component first gets rendered, and then whenever some data changes in the component, whenever some event happens in the component, these kind of use effects can be used. But in class-based view components, we have to use component did mount and other lifecycle methods. These are called lifecycle methods. I'll discuss lifecycle methods in the conventional documentation. You can refer to these lifecycle methods, and I will also discuss this in some time. So for us to actually fetch data, whenever this component renders, we have to override did mount, component did mount method. For example, let's say we need to declare this state variable. How do I do that? How does this component know that there is a state variable called status or something like data, all the news items? So for storing data or associating data to a specific component, we have to override its constructor and add those state variables to its reference, object reference. For that, we need to override something called constructor here. So this is what gets called whenever news object first gets initialized. So React internally handles all this logic in the function-based components. But if we have to have advanced control over how the components work, we have to override or use the class-based components. So this is advanced, but most likely you won't be using this. But for demonstrations and for familiarity, I'm teaching you this. So in the constructor, we can associate these values, just like we have declared in the function components. We can actually have state variables associated with this component. So one small thing here is we have to always give props here, and this is required. And we should use super of props whenever we are using the constructor. We should use this as the first statement. Then all the customizations you can do it next. So this is complaining that you haven't overridden anything. So that's why you don't need to have a constructor. If I don't declare this by default, this component, whenever this news component gets created, its parent constructor gets called. If I am overriding it, I have to actually have something advanced logic. This is only a IDE hint. The VS Code is hinting me that you haven't done any customizations to the constructor, so why do you bother overriding the constructor? So, but now I'm going to override the constructor to have some state variables. So this time I'm going to have the reference this. So this object refers to the current instance of news, and each instance of news will have its own state variable. So this is all abstracted away by this function-based components. And it's good to know how these things work internally. So let's say I want to store a state variable. This start state has to be initialized with some set of properties. So if I have status or news items, everything, all these items will get actually stored in the state variable of this component. So this is all handled internally, but this is how we can manipulate internal data like this. So in the state variable of this component, I'm going to initialize some properties, let's say news objects. So this component actually is going to render news items. So I'm going to use these news items here. So initially, when the object got constructed, this will be the state. News items will be empty list. And when the component gets first rendered, it has to fetch the data, let's say here, have to fetch data and then set the status. Let's say I will use this dot set state of the new state. So this is set state is a default method provided by the component. So this component will have constructor, componented, mount, render, and set state. All these are default methods available in the component class. So this is object-oriented programming in JavaScript. We will go over that in some time. So this set state will set the entire state variable. So here we are initializing the state to this object, and this state set state will accept a new object and replaces this state object with this new object. That's what we are going to do now. So we are going to fetch the data from the news API from here, and whatever this articles are written, those articles I'm going to use it here. Instead of news items, I'm going to use articles. That's articles. Let's use articles. Okay. So this fetch data we will do now. So for fetching the data, we will use a function called fetch, and we can actually use the URL to the API method, something like this. Copy this. I think my API is exposed here. I will delete it afterwards. So this one, if I copy this and use it inside here, this will fetch the news items that are there in the US and category, business category. So this is an asynchronous function. Basically, what asynchronous function does is it will do it in the background. It will run it in the background. The program logic will end, will not get locked because of this fetch. So either we should use await, or we should use another mechanism called then, or callback mechanism I'm going to use. Let's try changing this top line. This one, I'm going to use it as a variable. Let's use category as top line. And in this place, instead of hardcoding the entire string, I'm going to use category over here instead of hardcoding it. Later, I'm planning to use this category from as a parameter from parent components. And this one, I will just use query as this one. Entry words category business. And this entire thing will replace by query. And this API key, anyway, my API key is exposed, so I can move this to some other value, some other variable, const API. And oh. So after fetching this, there is a function called then that will accept a callback function. So the data that is response that is given by this API will be passed as a parameter to this callback function. So for that callback function, I'm going to use response as the value. This you can use anything, data or response or R1, something like that. You can use. The convention is to use response as the variable name, parameter name. from response, if I just do console log of response, this will give me the response from this particular API. So let's just go over to the app, go to the console. Let's go to console and we can see the object response here. So this happens whenever we reload. So whenever this component gets rendered, its response will be printed. The response object has response, and then it has the body, headers, all this. So this is basically a JSON response. So for this, we need to parse the JSON. Let's do that with function called response.json. That's it. Return. We have to return this from this callback function, and then there is something called chaining of callbacks. So first, then it's called after this gets finished. And after this function gets finished, I need to call another function. So I'm going to chain another then callback. This time, this is going to receive whatever this previous callback function returned. Thus, that data is going to receive as the parameter. I'm going to call this as data now. Then this, I'm going to print console log data. So whenever this component gets rendered, first it will do a fetch request, gets the response, and then does the JSON conversion, pass the response into JSON, and then returns that data, and that data gets passed on to the next callback, and that callback function is going to log that data to the console. Let's reload. You can see here, data got fetched, and we can see the articles, all these articles in here. So the data object has articles. Let's just do this. Start putting another object. We just so the data object has articles in it. So these articles, we are going to set the state to these articles. So in this place, instead of login, or we can leave the login as it is, and then we use this dot set state, and we are going to pass in an entirely new object here. So this object will start from here to here. So it will have articles as data dot articles. So this one has to be or that's the last line. You can leave the comma, but it's okay to keep the comma. Articles. Now, there are no address. So the state value has been set to articles as soon as the components gets mounted in the sense as soon as it gets rendered in the first place. At the first time, whenever it gets rendered, this method gets called and this state value will be set. Now in the render method, we can actually use this state value, all these articles, we can actually display this here. For now, let's use an unordered list in the render. Okay. Instead of doing that, let's just do some simple thing here without using just put JSON dot stringify of this dot state dot articles. This will just print the JSON that we got. objects. This object gets converted into, let's remove this also. It will entirely stringify the state object and places it in the DOM tree. Let's reload. All the JSON articles is shown as text here. So this is not looking good. So they will use unordered list purpose and let's display all the articles. So this time list. And this time I'm going to use a map function on the start state dot articles. So you might be thinking that this is better. So that's why people are using function-based components. So for advanced control, we will be using class-based components. But if we have to do the same thing that function-based components do, we have to do it all this way. So for each of the state articles, we'll map article this item be as article ID. Probably we'll see here each of the article has to have a unique ID. So let's see URL is unique. Let's use that URL as the key. So in the yesterday's as we seen that every list element should have a specific key, a unique key. It's required by the client. So article URL will be the unique key, and in the body we will be using the title of it. It is an article, not title. You now see all this listed. Great. So one last thing we need to do is we have handled the success scenario. So what if this request fails? We don't know if the category, query, API key are all correct or not. We don't know. So for handling that, we need to actually put one more callback called catch, which accepts a parameter called error. It's a callback. That callback that accepts a parameter called error, and this will do console log of error for now. Will not do anything. Later, when error happens, we will show some error message that we will do next. And now let's test this out. If the error is working or not. Let's just change this API key to something like API. Again, this is the wrong API key. And this was taken and status error, it's being thrown here. Still. So this time it's undefined. So if this fails, the state articles they will look into that later. So the erroring out we handle here. Let's remove this. And now one more improvement we'll do. This API key should not be put in the code. So this is insecure. So for that, we will do one thing. We will create a new file called .env and put a variable name called app API key. So in that, I'm going to give this key. So 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 and read from the env. This env file should not be committed to your repository. So this should not be exposed to anybody. The server has to know that key. So instead of this API key, I'm going to use the API key from the env. By default, env.env will be exposed to the entire application, React application. For accessing that, I need to use process.env, process.env dot whatever name you give for the API. And we can remove this. Let's reload. And there is some. We need to restart the server because we have WM exposed. Alright. So now we can fetch the data without the API being exposed in the code. Okay, this is how we get the data and show it in the page. Now let's do some optimizations to this. And we will create, instead of doing it as a list object, we will create some kind of layout that shows left side the kind of cards we will display, and right side we will list into a set of categories. So for that, we will extract this article into a different component. Let's create something called article, which is this time we'll be using function components, export default article, return something like this, and this will accept the article item. This item will display as. Currently, we'll just do a division. So this we will just print some item.id. And this we actually need to do like this. So default function is how we declare function component. This article, we're going to use it here instead of a list object. We'll just use division here. For each of the articles, we'll be using article, we as article URL, and we will use this article as the item as article. This self-closing. In this article, we need to import from components. Import article from /article. And this gives us the divisions. And these things, we will be making them into boxes, smaller boxes. That will do. Okay. Now this category and query, we will customize. We'll have first set of articles in one category and second set of articles in another category, like that. For that, let's go to app component. And let's convert this also into a class-based component. So we'll do class app extends component. which will have a constructor that will accept props, and inside that we will call super of props, and we will have a render method that returns this. I can actually copy this and make this in here. And this inside this we will have three categories. So for this news object, we are going to pass these as properties, category and query as properties. Let's convert this props to the news object. In this props, we will have category. So all these props will have, this time we have some state defined on this object also first to define the list of uh, categories and queries. We have define a state and initialize it with all this. Let's go here. We have different categories over here. So category is everything and query is this. Let's do that. And have objects news one. We define this as an object. We will have category as everything. Top headlines, we'll use top headlines as the category, and query as this country. And this news object, we are going to pass in as props. News plus this dot state dot news one. This is first component, and we will have another category. News two. We'll change this later. We have another category also. So two news items, news scrolls. We will have to go to news.js. This time this props will have that category also. Instead of using from here, we'll be using from props of stuff query using, and we will use the string of this. This dot props, we should use this dot props. Now let's component is not defined. Yeah. So basically we have to import this component from React library. Import component from React. And this happen. And this is shown as undefined. Basically, we have to use props dot names dot category. Props dot query. And below, we keep undefined. And sorry, there is a spelling mistake. Category. We now have this, but it's all mixed up. We will do some CSS in this to take that publish. So now we are rendering two categories. This category also I'll change to something like everything. I use source for crunch. First one. And query as this. See, all articles are coming, but we need to do a divider here. It's two horizontal rulers to differentiate two different thickness. This is coming from first section. We'll have another section. Category as everything. Yeah. Category as but we have two categories. We should use another category, another horizontal rulers. It means as and right, we have three. That one is right. All right. That's about how to fetch data from remote. And what else? Now, if something fails, create a component that will render errors if something fails. So we'll create a component called error.js. We have a default component. Let's define a constant. So there are two ways to define even the function components. We can either do it for default function error and return whatever we want. Yes, let's just say x1 technologies. Secure. This is one way to do it, or we can actually move this and just put export errors. Use this as a function like this. Port const. This is not a function. This is a value variable constant, and we can export this as a named export, or we can do export default. Something default is allowed here in this function, and we can just do remove this and define constant error like this and export it. Export default like this. So, or else we can define the entire thing in one place, like export default function error. Now we have defined an error component, but when we are fetching the data, if something fails, instead of console log, we have to render that component. we have to return this error. So for that, we need to store the error somewhere in the state. Let's have that error also in the state. Error is false. Initially, error is false. If there is an error, we will set the status to error. Here, we start set state of error as true. And we will set articles to empty. And in the render method, so we are going to see if there is error is true, display the error, otherwise display the articles. In this place, we are going to see if this dot state dot error, the error is true, return error. So this we have to import from the components, import error from error. And if not, if there is no error, then return this. This works the same, except when we change something. I'll change this key, refresh something. Okay, it did not refresh because running the server, we start the server and let's refresh. And we have to handle this error somewhere. Somebody is accessing the map function if it is geometry property of undefined. The map function in news.js. I go to news 37. Here, if the articles is null, so accessing the map function, because errors and change this to question mark. If it exists, then only access it. Unauthorized. So as we are getting the error of the news, we are anything interacting. This error is not getting set when the error is happening. So that we need to do that. Or if this happens, okay, it's not the error, it's the response code. Go to the network, go to this, and the response is coming, but it is giving the unauthorized error. It's not erroring out in the code, not as an exception. So in the JSON response, we have status as error. And if I have, we have to check the status of this in the response. Data status equals error, then this dot set state of articles as empty, error as true. And we can have message also in custom properties. And if this fails, not because of authorization error, but because of any errors in the HTTP requests or in the network, the other catch will catch the error. If it's a network error, it will catch error. If it is internal error, which is an authorization error or internal server errors and other errors, the status will be handling that. And here, from here, we can actually return. So if the key is wrong, it's showing that message. I'll change the key back. Let's restart the server. I go to the terminal and restart. So whenever this env gets changed, we need to restart. Now we have our articles come. So this stylings can be applied on top of this, and all that can be done. So basically, this is how we use APIs to fetch the data from DB. So this API server is implemented in a different way. It will be using its own database and storing data. So this is only the front end portion of it and how to fetch the data. And there are other ways to cache the data, store the data in the browser storage. And so whenever this time, the disadvantage of this is whenever we load the page or re-render this component, this data gets fetched again over and over again. So if the data doesn't change, we need to fetch it from local, which will be handled using state libraries that we will be discussing in our subsequent classes. So that's about today.